much. Before addressing the issue of space security, I would like to say congratulations to the conveners of this particular forum. It's one of these very rare opportunities in universities that are so hemmed in by metrics and short-term outcomes to see something that is looking 20, 30, maybe 40 or 50 years into the future, something that is a real cauldron of pure intellectual inquiry, innovation, imagination. This, to my mind, is a university functioning at its very best, at its finest. So it's such a privilege to be here, and I'm most grateful for the opportunity. Thank you very much for that. Right, space security. I'm going to give you a rather long prologue relative to the rest of my presentation by dwelling on a few assumptions. The first is that I'm assuming that this mining I'll be talking about anyway in terms of security will be mining on the moon. I note that the topic is off-Earth mining, but I'm afraid I find it hard to get my imagination around actually capturing asteroids, mining gas giants, or whatever else particular superior intellectual competence can come up with. So I'm staying with the moon. For me, that's challenging enough because I know that when we deliver a satellite out to geosynchronous orbit around 36,000 kilometres linear, the payload we can get out there is only a little over half of what we can build into low Earth orbit at about 1,500 kilometres. So there's a massive fall-off in our carrying capacity out there. Of course, you can trade that up in terms of time and other ways. I appreciate that, but it is an issue. And the moon, of course, is not 36,000 kilometres tall, but it has a mean orbital distance from Earth linear of 384,000 kilometres. So it's quite a different kettle of fish. Secondly, I'm going to assume that our process will be automated to the maximum extent possible. There will be minimal or no human involvement. I say that because once you start putting humans in space, the cost goes up exponentially. Nobody's ever been going to add it up. The figures are hidden all over the place. Every attempt to cost humans in space seems to fail. For that reason, you cannot collate the figures. But they are huge. Even resupplying the International Space Station is incredible, leading to one article that was headed the $10,000 sandwich. So it is a problem. And of course, the main orbit of the International Space Station is around 330 to 420 kilometres linear above Earth. And the main orbit of the moon, as I said, is 384,000 kilometres. So the moon's basically 1,000 times further out than the ISS. And that's not counting all the extra orbits and loops you have to fly to get to the moon. The third thing I'm going to assume is that the transport challenges are going to be manageable. We've had a lot of discussion on the ingenuity of robotics and processing and so forth, the minerals in space, and the progress that is being made there is absolutely spectacular. The progress with rocketry is nowhere near as spectacular. The Apollo rocket that was used in 1969 to take men to the moon, that had a fully fueled mass of about 2.8 million kilograms. And what it transported to the moon ultimately was the lunar module, which weighed approximately 14,700 kilograms. So if you look at your maths, that's a ratio of about 1 to 190. In other words, about 0.5% of the total payload was converted into the final stage landing on the moon, about 0.5%. And the largest return payload collected by any Apollo mission in terms of moon material was 110 kilograms of moon substance. So one has to keep that sort of thing in mind. There have been no dramatic technological efficiencies with rocketry for ages. In fact, throughout my entire career, they've been promised. Right now, Russia's saying they have a new fuel that will deliver 20% better efficiency. I'll believe it when I see it. I've been hearing it for years. And in fact, when I was preparing for this lecture, I checked on what sort of fuel was being used for the lunar module. And the fuel in 1969 was unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine activated by nitrogen tetroxide. Now, that was a very, very sexy fuel for 1969, but right now it's one of the most common fuels in space today. And that gives you an idea of how glacial has been the progress in rocketry and in rocket fuels. But no matter what sort of improvements, enhancements are made, the one thing to keep in mind is the first law of thermodynamics is going to apply to all of these equations, no matter where we go, no matter what we put into a rocket or other vehicle to get it out into space and to go into a mining operation. I've also assumed there will be a continuous mining process, because if it's going to be only a one-off, then it's best characterised, I would suggest, as prospecting rather than mining. So my plan is to talk about what space security means, what the implications of it are, hedging against international intervention particularly, and then some summary comments. I don't like the term takeaways because it reminds me rather of a hamburger, so I call them TRUs to reflect upon. So, what does space security mean? Well, candidly, it means different things to different people. A commercial satellite operator will be regarding space security as an environment in which they can use the satellite to provide their product without due interference. A military commander will be saying space security means that they can deter attack on space assets, and if their space assets are attacked, they can cause more damage than they receive, and in which case they think they're secure. Scientists or engineers would like to be able to send a space vehicle out to take observations, perhaps in the asteroid belt, without it being destroyed. That's the scientist's view of security, and on it goes. And they're very different approaches. Basically, though, security in outer space means two things. One, identifying risks and avoiding them, or identifying risks and minimising them by hedging strategies. And the hedging strategies can mean anything at all, basically, from designing triple redundancy circuits to equipment, to buying insurance, and there are companies that will sell you insurance for space missions, but the risks are enormous, and they include not only those issues, but the geopolitical environment, the international tensions that can derail space projects, and don't forget, probably 80 to 90% of a mining project will be organised on Earth. It'll be a terrestrial issue, not a space issue as such. Solar weather and space environment more generally. Remember, of course, that the Earth is subject to 13 major meteoroid events every year, almost continuous. Fortunately, they don't all peak at the same time or in the same year, but we have a fair amount of meteoroid activity around the planet Earth. We have legal issues to contend with, partly the formal legal issues, and partly the fact that all of the space treaties so far have been ignored wholesale, and therefore the space environment is almost lawless, despite a body of international law floating around the place. Particularly the Moon Agreement that Dr. Lawler referred to yesterday, which no major spacefaring nation has signed, with the possible exception of India, if you, pardon me, regard India as a major spacefaring nation. And India has signed but has not ratified or acceded to that treaty. Then there's technical financing, a commercial risk market for product, competition risk that somebody mentioned earlier, and above all, the synthetic duplication of product risk. If you come across something in space, can it be duplicated on Earth, and will that duplication process be, or the synthesization process, be more economical than going out and getting it in space? So there are some major issues to be tackled there. But most of these hedging strategies ultimately are not all that different from any large terrestrial projects. The majority of security issues will be much greater than they are for terrestrial projects. And what that tells me is that a project such as this is going to require the most exceptionally capable project management skills. I think that's the highest risk of failure would be inadequate project management. Nothing to do with what happens in space. That is the major security risk, I believe. Some of the implications of space security. The first thing is, I noticed that in this wonderful brochure, it's very nicely printed and so forth, there's a mention of Australia being a very logical place for a project of this nature. I find it hard to agree with that, I must say, although there may be all sorts of reasons with which I'm not familiar, but it seems to me that Australia could not contemplate going it alone for a project such as this, not just for reasons associated with security, but for a vast number of other technological challenges that are quite beyond our capacity to resolve. we are going to need partnership with another major, with a major state. And there is some cooperation, some precedent cooperation between the major states. So it might be even a consortium of major states. For example, we have the US and Russia are working overtly compatibly over the International Space Station. The US buys from Russia rocket engines for its Atlas launch vehicles. So often you'll see a vehicle go up on the television with the United States of America down the side, but it's powered by Russian motors. And there's, with China and the United States, you'll find that one of the top exports from the US to China, technological exports, is components for nuclear reactors. So there's a very complicated international set of relationships emerge, and they're very dynamic. At the same time, we have the US busily ringing China and Russia with new missile installations in the Middle East and across the NATO countries. So you can see there's layers within layers in these relationships, and we are going to have to get into bed with one of those major powers, or perhaps a consortium of them, if we're going to get into space and do some mining. Return on investment, I noticed that in our previous presentation, the return on investment was regarded as a financial thing. Yes, that is an issue, but it's not the only game in town. Return on investment can also be political, and the political return can be absolutely enormous. If you go back and read the Eisenhower papers prior to the initial decision to go to the moon, you'll see that America appreciated the enormous psychological benefits of putting human beings in space, regarding that as far greater than any possible financial return. And those papers, by the way, are available on the Papers for the President's work sites on the web, readily available. And it's worth having a look at. And they were right. When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon on the 20th of July 1969, I was a humble undergraduate at Monash University at the time, the world immediately seemed to forget that the USSR, Russia, was the first state to launch an artificial satellite. It was the first state to put a living animal into space, the first one to put a human being into space. Russia was the first one to put a vehicle on the moon, the first state to record the far side of the moon, the first to take a human spacewalk, the first to make a soft landing on the moon, the first to collect moon material and return it to Earth, the first to send a spacecraft into the atmosphere of Venus, and so on the record goes. All of this was written off basically in the popular mind, in the global popular mind, when Neil Armstrong put out his first step for mankind. So there is some massive political capital in going to the moon or going to somewhere else and doing something imaginative and properly marketed. This may be one of the great motivators for a space mining venture. It may be the greatest motivator for a space mining venture. So, sorry, just catching up with myself here. I should read the notes a bit more rather than chatting ad hoc in an ad hoc manner. But we will need, I think, to build into a plane like this some assurance that it's not going to lead to a conflict with another major power, because if that looks like happening, all of the players will walk away very, very quickly. And that could happen in a positive way, that a program could result in bringing back some material that offers a positive strategic advantage to one state, something, for example, that's intensely useful for nanotechnology, cannot be easily duplicated. It can also have a negative effect. So if you start bringing back, as someone suggested, cartloads of platinum or diamond or gold or something of that nature and upset the global market, trust me, that will have an international effect that will not be supportive. So we must avoid anything that has a trigger for commercial or political insecurity. Remembering, of course, that an adverse response to this need not be confined to outer space. It could be something that's terrestrial, such as commercial, technological, legal, diplomatic, and so on and so forth. There are all sorts of ways for people to express their displeasure outside of the space environment. However, if we did upset a major state, or if a major state became upset with what was going on, in the space environment, so far as mining was concerned, there is a capacity to conduct a shooting war in space. And I rather suspect, although it's not particularly relevant to the mining environment, I was invited here to put a bit of sexy stuff into this, so I'll oblige by doing that and tell you that there is a fundamental capacity to conduct space warfare. It's been going on for years. The weapon systems are well developed, they've been tested, they work perfectly well. And in fact, after 12 days after Sputnik 1's launch, before the United States ever had a satellite in space, they'd already tested one space weapon, which was a space mine, shooting pellets into the path of an oncoming satellite. If you think about the old formula for kinetic energy, a half mass times velocity squared, you can see that it doesn't take an awful lot of stuff hitting a satellite to do a tremendous amount of damage. So space warfare and space weapons are well and truly established. We have nuclear weapons. I know they're illegal under Article 4 of the Outer Space Convention, Outer Space Treaty 1967. That's been ignored since the day it was tabled. And in fact, numerous nuclear weapons have been tested in space, and they work extremely well, depending on your view of what extremely well is. The trouble is that it's very hard to contain their impact, and in fact, in the 9th of July 1962, the United States, in a test known as Starfish Prime, detonated a 1.4 megaton weapon in space, and it did successfully knock out the satellite it was intended to knock out, and 5 others as well. Most embarrassingly, one of them belonging to Britain, and even more embarrassingly, one of them belonging to Russia. Kinetic weapons are well proven, and they will take out satellites or your own rockets that are going to and from a venue out in space somewhere. Disadvantages some debris, but not as much as with a nuclear weapon. And there are also, pardon me, co-orbital weapons. That is to say, satellites are designed to co-locate with another space vehicle, do it some damage, and the range of things they can do are quite enormous. They can spray paint at it. That's one thing the United States has tried, spray paint over surfaces and sensors. They can exude microwave energy to destroy or damage circuitry within the space vehicle. There's all sorts of things that co-orbital vehicles can do. There are also a series of electronic weapons in space that can interfere with communications and the functionings of satellites or space vehicles of any kind. They're expensive, they're difficult to trace, but the disadvantage is that satellites are getting more and more savvy and therefore more able to resist them. There are also lasers and dazzlers which could not possibly affect the sort of operation you're talking about here today. So the essence of the issue is really that you can forget about those weapons on the whole, provided you have a relationship with the US, Russia, or the PRC, possibly with some buy-in from Japan, India, Brazil, or Israel. This would be one of the decisions in a space mining venture that one would need to make very early, because we're looking at an incredibly long lead time with specially designed space vehicles to get there and back. The reason I say to forget about most of these weapons being used is that the US, the PRC and Russia, despite overt aggression, treat each other with very considerable respect. There's been no nuclear conflict between them, despite incredible provocation from time to time, and all 3 of them have a formidable armoury of space weapons, experience in using them, and they are not about to provoke each other to starting a conflict in space unless there's something absolutely critical going on, and your mining venture will not provide that trigger, I would suggest. So, and they're the only 3 people with the technical capacity to form the partners with Australia. The US, of course, has a long relationship, history with Australia through ANZUS and other arrangements. Strong technology background, been to the moon, has lots of economic woes at the moment, but might just decide it would accept a project like this as a major distraction from its economic woes, as occurred in the 50s and 60s, and it worked extremely well for the US. Russia has also had considerable technology and moon experience, but it's extremely economically challenged at the moment, and it's putting its defence and space type money into a new family of ICBMs and also into a new family of satellites. So I don't think Russia's going to be stumping up the cash to engage in something like this. The PRC, China, minimal moon experience per se, but lots of cash. And China might just well follow the lead and take on a project like this. It's already building its space station, as you would know, the Tiangong space station. China's doing this well knowing that it's going to be a scientific white elephant, pretty much the way the ISS is. There's hardly anything the ISS does that couldn't be done by robotics. And the scientific work that it does do is really indicating the capacity to put more people in space for longer. But if you don't put them in space at all, then that work's substantially negated. But China has figured out there is tremendous kudos in having people in space, and so the Tiangong is going ahead. And so it's the sort of thing that China might just be prepared to sign up to. China has one major advantage over the US and Russia, and that is that the mean age of its space engineers is about 20 years younger. So while the US and Russia are about to have a mass redundancy of their skilled workforce in space, China's got a constant stream coming along, which it is maintaining in a very ruthless and efficient sort of way. So China is a possible, definitely. Having rushed through all of that, the takeaways, or if you like to reflect upon, in my view, firstly, that space is a very rough neighbourhood. Space is essentially a lawless neighbourhood. You've got to watch your step, and the way to watch your step is to make sure that all of the prerequisites are in place terrestrially before initiating anything that leaves the Earth's atmosphere. That's the critical issue. Secondly, security is a fundamentally broad and pervasive consideration. It involves economic security, engineering, project management, so on and so forth. There are a whole range of security issues that must be taken into account at every stage of a project such as this. And thirdly, I believe that security and project management must proceed compatibly. Project management is the key issue in an enterprise such as we're envisaging here with Space Mine. Thank you.
Well, Roy's coming under time.
Right.
Roy, most of the talks here have been technical, but I feel that it's somehow legal to ask you a policy question. How do you feel about the idea of Australia having a space agency of its own and or a space agency jointly with another nation?
We're into a legalistic thing here, and look, I'll confess to a serious sin here, and trust you never to let this get back to the science faculty or I'll be court-martialed and thrown out. But I actually started off with a law degree. I dabbled in part of the drafting of the Australian Space Activities Act, and anyway, I don't want to go into all that horrible, messy, nauseous, unscientific business. But the problem with a space agency is that in Australia particularly, that probably 78% of the value that we get from space is intelligence classified related value. It's nothing to do with the commercial world. And that is not going to be allowed to migrate into some agency that's blending the two of them, that's heavily corralled. It's going to stay that way. And so then we get into the issue of what is the space agency going to do? Can it effectively be employed by the government and serve the government, and equally well serve the private sector or the commercial sector of space? And that's the sort of confliction that's impacted very adversely in Canada and a couple of other places. They just haven't been able to manage that. And I note that only, I think, 2 days ago, it was announced there's going to be an inquiry into Britain into their recently revamped, I might add, space agency to decide whether it'll continue, whether it is advantageous or not, and so forth. So space agencies don't seem to work terribly well. I know that nearly every country has one and so forth, but their productivity, their utility, and the way in which they're able to scoop up government interests, commercial interests on the one hand, and the classified intelligence stuff, which every nation has one way or another on the other, is not good. So I'd like to see the publicity, I'd like to see the presence, the profile of space increased. That's one way to do it, but we would have to manage it with considerable care and put this space agency in something of a straitjacket so it didn't start dabbling all over the place. That's my feeling on it anyway.
Really, thank you.
Anyone else? I'm not going to get into a space agency.
Very interesting talk, thank you. You said there's very little point in Australia trying to become a spacefaring nation in its own right, which seems to make sense. Where do you see the strongest possibilities for Australian, like universities like ASA here, developing local skills, techniques, knowledge, what have you, for engaging with the bigger boys overseas?
Well, I think there's basically two areas. One is, we've seen a classic example of it today, this sheer and incredibly courageous, wonderful effort of pure intellectual inquiry that comes up with wonderful, innovative ideas. Frankly, and I'll be perfectly blunt here, I don't really care if we ever do mine anything in space or not. This sort of forum is the sort of place that produces brand new, innovative thinking, new concepts. It's an absolute crucible for innovation, and I think that's one way to do it. The second thing is there's tremendous capacity. We have some of them already operating in Australia, one here in Sydney, producing components for space vehicles, and we can even produce subsystems for space vehicles and do it quite successfully, again, in a strong, innovative, reliable, beautifully engineered way. I know one example of somebody who came to me from an agency I won't mention. He had something made in Australia and took it back to his own country, and the cost of making this particular item in Australia was less than he'd been quoted for the scoping study in his own home country. So we have some tremendous capacity in our engineering, is of a very high standard, extremely good intellectual stock, not a lot of places for people to go, so you can take the cream of the cream getting them into the space type world. So there are some fabulous advantages to that sort of thing. I do not see us building whole satellites, maybe, except for blue sat, square sat, mini something or other. That's one of them's been on the board for that. One of them's been on the board since I was a chicken, and still hasn't got to orbit. I mean, there are, if you ever go around the large space facilities in the world, the Astriums, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, they have all these huge clean rooms, and there'll be one person sitting at a workstation doing something with a soldering iron. I mean, they are so underemployed, it's unbelievable. The market is massively under-supporting the huge facilities globally. Doesn't matter if you're in Russia or America, UK, France, you name it, they are desperately underemployed and they have a hell of a lot of expertise. So, to start another one here, even the scale, say, Israel has, I think is commercial suicide, gains very little for us.
I'm not going to enter that one either. Anyone else? Okay, great. Thanks, Roy.